The fire started at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in June. Lightning hit the main barn first, a single bolt that turned 60 years of structural timber into an accelerant. By the time Dale Hutchins made it outside in his boots and underwear, the equipment shed was already involved. Flames were punching through the roof where he stored the baler. The diesel tanks hadn't gone yet, but they would. He didn't call 911 right away. He ran, not toward the fire, toward the far shed. The one his grandfather built in 1962 with railroad ties and corrugated tin. The one nobody used anymore because it sat 200 yards from the main compound, half buried in trumpet vine and rotted fence line. The one that held a 1957 Massey Ferguson 35 that hadn't turned over in 9 years. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived from town, Dale was standing in that far shed with a flashlight, staring at 3,200 pounds of red sheet metal and cast iron, while his livelihood burned orange against the horizon behind him. The neighbors who showed up to help said later they'd never seen a man look that calm while everything he owned turned to smoke. They didn't understand yet. Dale wasn't calm. He was counting. The sun came up on a disaster. The main barn was gone, total structural collapse. The equipment shed looked like something out of a war documentary. Steel roofing had melted into waves. The John Deere 7230R he'd paid off 8 months earlier sat in the center of the wreckage with its hood peeled open and its wiring harness fused into a black sculpture. The tires had burned down to the rims. Next to it, the 6140M he used for baling, completely destroyed. The 1990 Case IH combine he'd bought used in 2015, scorched to the frame. His backup tractor, a 2003 John Deere 6420 with 11,000 hours, ruined. The insurance adjuster showed up at 9 a.m. with a clipboard and a tape measure. He walked the wreckage for 40 minutes, took photos from every angle, and met Dale by the gravel road where the fire trucks were still parked. "You got livestock loss?" "No livestock," Dale said, "just equipment." The adjuster flipped through his notes. "Policy's going to cover the structures at replacement cost, but the equipment's going to be actual cash value, depreciated." "What's that come to?" "Barn and sheds, about $140,000. The tractors and combine, maybe $95,000 total. You had the Deere 7230R listed at $78,000 purchase price in 2019, but it's 5 years old now, high hours. I'm seeing $31,000 actual value." Dale didn't respond. The adjuster kept talking. "Same deal on the others. The 6140M is going to be maybe $22,000. Case combined, $38,000. The old 6420, maybe $4,000. That's $95,000 for equipment I couldn't replace for under $180,000 used." "That's how ACV works," the adjuster said. "Depreciation's a killer. But hey, you got $235,000 coming total. That'll get you back in business." Dale looked at him like he'd just suggested farming with a shovel. $140,000 of that goes to rebuilding structures," Dale said. "That leaves me $95,000 for equipment to work 1,100 acres. You think I can buy a combine, a primary tractor, and a utility rig for under 6 figures? The adjuster shrugged. "You might want to talk to your bank about a loan for the difference." Dale walked into Farmers State Bank 3 days later wearing clean jeans and the same boots he'd worn the night of the fire. The loan officer, a man named Terry Millstone, who'd gone to high school with Dale's younger brother, met him in a glass-walled conference room with a view of Main Street. Terry had the paperwork ready. "I ran the numbers before you got here," Terry said, sliding a printout across the table. "Here's what we're looking at. Insurance gives you $235,000. You rebuild the barn and sheds for $140,000. That leaves $95,000 for equipment. If you want to get back to operational capacity, you're going to need at least another $120,000 financed." Dale looked at the terms. 7-year note, 6.8% interest, payments of $1,847 a month. "That's almost $22,000 a year," Dale said. "That's correct. I clear about $48,000 a year on 1,100 acres in a good year. You're asking me to give you half my net income before I pay property tax, seed, fuel, or chemicals." Terry folded his hands. "Dale, you just lost everything. This is what recovery looks like. You finance your way back in, you run tight for a few years, and eventually you're whole again. Or I run tight for a few years and one bad harvest puts me under. Then what's your plan? Terry asked. You can't farm 100 acres with no equipment. Dale stood up. I'll figure it out. Terry watched him leave. Later that afternoon, he mentioned the meeting to a buddy at the co-op. By evening, the whole township knew Dale Hutchins had walked out of the bank with no financing and no plan. The rumor mill ran hot. Some people said he was done. Others said he'd sell the ground and retire early at 53. A few thought he'd lease the acreage to his neighbor, a man named Carl Prairie, who ran 2,400 acres of deer iron and had been making quiet offers on Dale's land for 3 years. Nobody thought he'd keep farming. Dale spent the next 2 days in the far shed. The Massey Ferguson 35 sat exactly where his grandfather had parked it in 2015, covered in dust, bird droppings, and a tarp that had rotted through in 4 places. It was a 1957 model, 35 horsepower, gasoline engine, 3-point hitch, no cab, just sheet metal, a steel seat, and enough torque to pull a 2-bottom plow if you were patient. His grandfather had bought it new for $2,100. Dale pulled the tarp off and stared. The paint was faded, the front tires were flat, the exhaust pipe had a wasp nest in it, but the sheet metal was solid, no rust-through, no structural damage. It had been stored inside its entire life. He tried the key. Nothing. He pulled the dipstick. The oil was black and thick, but it was there. He checked the coolant. Dry. The fuel tank was empty except for a 1/4 inch of varnish at the bottom. Dale walked back to the remains of his equipment shed and pulled a toolbox from the wreckage, one of the few things that had survived. He grabbed a socket set, a fuel can, a battery charger, and a jug of fresh oil. Then he went to work. Bringing a tractor back from 9 years of sitting isn't romantic. It's fluid changes, fuel system cleaning, and hoping the engine isn't seized. Dale drained the old oil first, thick as molasses, smelling like varnish and thyme. He refilled it with 15-watt 40. He pulled the spark plugs and hit each cylinder with penetrating oil, let it sit overnight, then turned the engine by hand with a breaker bar on the crank pulley. It moved. Not easy, but it moved. He cleaned the carburetor, flushed the fuel system, and rigged a temporary fuel line from a 1-gallon can. He inflated the tires with a hand pump. He jumped the electrical system with cables from his truck. Then he turned the key. The starter groaned. The engine coughed. And on the 4th try, the Massey Ferguson 35 fired. It ran rough, missing on one cylinder, belching blue smoke from oil that had settled in the valve guides. But it ran. Dale sat on that tractor in the far shed with the engine rattling beneath him and the smell of burned oil filling the air, and for the first time since the fire, he smiled. Not because the situation was good, because he had a move. Here's what Dale had. One Massey Ferguson 35 with 35 horsepower and 68 years of age. One far shed that hadn't burned, $200 in cash he'd kept in his truck, 1,100 acres that needed planting, spraying, and harvesting, and a township full of people waiting to see him fail. Here's what he didn't have: a combine, a modern tractor, a planter, a sprayer, a baler, financing. The math was brutal. If Dale wanted to farm even half his acreage, he needed equipment that could cover 500-plus acres in a planting window that lasted 3 weeks. The Massey Ferguson 35 could pull a 4-row planter at maybe 3 miles per hour. That meant 12-hour days just to keep pace. And he didn't own a planter anymore. He sat in the far shed with a notebook and ran the numbers. Option 1, sell the ground. Carl DePrairie would pay $4,200 an acre. That's $4.6 million. Dale could retire, move to town, and never look at a tractor again. Option 2, lease the ground. Carl would pay $185 an acre cash rent. That's $203,500 a year. Dale could live on that and avoid the humiliation of quitting. Option 3, farm it himself with a 35-horsepower tractor and no money. He stared at option 3 for a long time. Then he circled it. Dale's first call was to a man named Eugene Trask, who ran a custom harvesting crew out of Nebraska. Eugene had combined Dale's beans in 2018 when the case was down for a week with header problems. "Eugene, it's Dale Hutchins. You still running that crew? Every fall, you need combining?" "Yeah, but I can't pay cash this year. I can pay you in bushels, 20% of yield." There was a pause. What happened to your case? Burned up in a fire, lost everything. Eugene was quiet for a moment. Then, 20% steep. It's what I got. All right, I'll put you on the schedule. One problem solved. Next, planting. Dale drove to an estate auction 40 miles south where a retiring farmer was selling off equipment. He walked the lot, ignored the new iron, and found what he was looking for in the back corner. A 1980s John Deere 7000 4-row planter. No-till coulters, mechanical seed meters, chain drive. It sold for $1,100. Dale bid $200. He lost. The winning bidder, a young farmer in a Carhartt jacket, paid $1,350 and loaded it on a trailer. Dale watched him leave, then walked to his truck and sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. He just spent his entire cash reserve on a bid that didn't win. He had $0. One tractor and no planter. That night, Dale sat in the far shed with the Massey Ferguson idling and thought about his grandfather. The old man had started farming in 1959 with 160 acres, a used farmall, and a handshake loan from a neighbor. He'd built the operation to 800 acres by 1985 without ever financing through a bank. He paid cash for equipment, bought used, and kept things running with baling wire and stubbornness. When he died in 2014, he'd told Dale one thing: a tractor that runs is worth more than a tractor that's paid off. Dale turned off the Massey Ferguson and walked back to the house. He made a list of every farmer within 30 miles who might have old equipment sitting unused. Then he started making calls. The first farmer Dale called was a man named Vern Hollister, who'd retired in 2016 and still had a machine shed full of 1970s iron. "Vern, it's Dale Hutchins. I heard you might have an old 4-row planter sitting around." "I got a white 5100, hasn't been used in 8 years. Does it work? Last time I tried it, yeah. Why?" "I need to borrow it for spring planting. I'll return it in the same condition and give you 100 bushels of corn as payment." Vern laughed. "You don't got a planter?" "Lost everything in a fire." The line went quiet. Then, "You serious about farming with no equipment?" "Dead serious." "All right, you can use it, but I don't need corn. Just bring it back and we're square." Dale picked up the white 5100 the next morning. It was a mechanical planter. No electronics, no fancy metering, just seed boxes, press wheels, and faith. Dale spent 2 days in the far shed, rebuilding the seed meters, replacing dry-rotted belts, and fabricating a hitch adapter so the Massey Ferguson could pull it. Next problem, herbicide. Dale called another retired farmer named Lloyd Kestner. "Lloyd, you still got that pull-type sprayer?" "The old 200-gallon rig? Yeah, it's in the shed. Can I borrow it for the season? I'll pay you in beans." "What happened to your equipment?" "Barn fire," Lloyd sighed. "Just take it. You don't owe me anything." One by one, Dale pieced together a makeshift fleet. Borrowed 4-row planter, borrowed 200-gallon sprayer, rented no-till drill from the co-op, $15 an acre, custom combining arranged for 20% of yield, his own Massey Ferguson 35 for all of it. The whole operation ran on handshake deals, barter, and the understanding that if Dale failed, nobody got paid. Planting started May 8th. Dale rolled into the field at 5:15 a.m. with the Massey Ferguson 35 and the borrowed white planter. The sun wasn't up yet. The ground was cold. The planter's seed meters rattled like a ghost in a tin can. He planted at 2.8 miles per hour. His neighbors with modern 16-row planters were covering 40 acres a day. Dale was covering 11. Every pass took forever. The Massey Ferguson had no cab, just a steel seat and an umbrella. Dale rigged from a broke beach umbrella frame and duct tape. When it rained, he got wet. When the sun came out, he baked. The tractor had no radio, no air conditioning, no power steering, just a steering wheel, a throttle, and 35 horsepower that didn't quit. By May 23rd, Dale had planted 480 acres of corn and 190 acres of soybeans. It took him 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and more back pain than he wanted to admit. But it was done. Carl DePrairie drove past Dale's field on May 24th in his John Deere 9RX with the air conditioning running and the autopilot steering. He slowed down, looked at Dale sitting on the Massey Ferguson with no cab, and shook his head. He didn't wave. By mid-June, people were talking, not because Dale had planted, because he was still going. While his neighbors parked their equipment and waited for spraying season, Dale was running the Massey Ferguson every single day. He mowed ditches for the County Road Commission for $40 an hour. He plowed gardens for elderly neighbors for $25 a plot. He pulled a hay rake for a guy 10 miles east who needed help and paid in diesel fuel. The Massey Ferguson became a fixture. People saw it on the road at dawn. They saw it in fields at dusk. They saw it parked outside the co-op while Dale bought oil and filters in bulk. One morning, a farmer named Ed Corcoran stopped Dale at the grain elevator. "I heard you're farming with your grandpa's old Massey." "That's right. How's that going?" Dale looked at him. "It's going." Ed nodded. "Well, hell, if you need any help, let me know." It was the first time anyone had offered. July hit like a hammer. Temperatures spiked into the mid-90s. The corn was knee-high and growing fast, but so were the weeds. Dale needed to spray, and he needed to spray now. He hooked the borrowed 200-gallon sprayer to the Massey Ferguson, filled it with post-emergent herbicide, and rolled into the field at 6 a.m. He made it 40 acres. Then the Massey Ferguson started knocking. It was a rod bearing. Dale knew the sound immediately. A rhythmic metallic hammering from deep in the engine that meant something internal was coming apart. He shut it down in the middle of the field, climbed off, and stood there in the heat while the engine ticked and cooled. If the engine was done, he was done. There was no backup plan, no second tractor, no financing to fix it. The Massey Ferguson was the entire operation. Dale pulled his phone and called the only mechanic he trusted, a man named Hap Steiner who'd been rebuilding farm engines since 1971. "Hap, it's Dale. I got a rod knock in a Massey 35. Can you rebuild it?" "Probably." "What year?" 1957. Hap laughed. "Those engines are bulletproof. Bring it in." "What's it gonna cost?" "Parts and labor, maybe $1,200. Dale didn't have $1,200. He didn't have $200. He had $13 in his checking account and a corn crop 3 weeks from needing side dress nitrogen. "I'll figure it out," Dale said and hung up. That afternoon, Dale sat in the far shed and stared at the Massey Ferguson. He could sell the ground. Carl DePrairie's offer was still on the table. $4.6 million, enough to walk away clean. Or he could call the bank, eat crow, and finance his way back into modern equipment. Or he could fix the Massey Ferguson and keep going. Dale walked to the house, pulled out the title to his pickup truck, and drove to the bank. Terry Millstone looked up when Dale walked in. "I need to borrow $1,500 against my truck," Dale said. Terry blinked. "For what?" "Engine rebuild." "On what?" "The Massey Ferguson." Terry leaned back in his chair. "Dale, I can get you into a used tractor for $30,000 with financing. You don't have to run a 70-year-old machine into the ground." "I'm not asking for a tractor loan," Dale said. "I'm asking for $1,500 against a truck worth $8,000. Terry printed the paperwork. Dale signed. 3 days later, Hap Steiner called. "Your engine's done. Come pick it up." Dale reinstalled the engine himself in the far shed. It took him 6 hours, a come-along and 2 jacks. When he was done, he filled the fluids, turned the key, and the Massey Ferguson fired like it was 1957 all over again. No knock, no smoke, just clean, mechanical horsepower. Dale sat on that tractor and let it idle for 10 minutes, listening to the engine, feeling the vibration through the seat. Then he hooked up the sprayer and went back to work. Fall came fast. By late September, the corn was ready. Dale called Eugene Trask, and the custom crew rolled in with a Case IH 8250 combine that could harvest 200 acres a day. Dale followed behind in the Massey Ferguson, pulling a grain cart he'd borrowed from Ed Corcoran. The yield came in at 187 bushels per acre. That was 89,760 bushels total on 480 acres. Eugene took 20%, 17,952 bushels. Dale kept the rest. At $4.10 a bushel, that was $294.12 gross. Subtract seed, chemicals, fuel, and custom combining, Dale netted $71,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was survival. The soybeans came off 2 weeks later. Yield was 52 bushels per acre on 190 acres, 9,880 bushels total. At $10.80 a bushel, that was $106,704 gross. After expenses, Dale cleared another $38,000. Total net for the year, $109,000, the most he'd ever made. In November, Dale drove to the Massey Ferguson dealer in Brookfield. the same one he'd driven past 100 times but never stopped at. He walked in wearing clean jeans and boots, and a salesman named Rick Tomlinson met him at the door. "Help you with something?" "I want to buy a tractor," Dale said. Rick's eyes lit up. "New or used?" "Used. Something in the 100-120 horsepower range, cab, loader, good hours." Rick walked him through the lot. They stopped at a 2015 Massey Ferguson 6713 with 4,100 hours, a loader, and a cab with air conditioning. "This one's $52,000, Rick said. Dale looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I'll take it." Rick blinked. "You want to finance?" "No. I'll pay cash." Rick stared at him. "You have $52,000 cash?" "I have $71,000 cash," Dale said. "The rest is going into a savings account in case I ever have another fire." Rick wrote up the sale. When Dale drove the 6713 off the lot, Rick walked back inside and told the other salesman what had just happened. Nobody believed him. Dale parked the Massey Ferguson 67113 in the rebuilt equipment shed and walked to the far shed where the 35 still sat. He'd put 680 hours on it in one season. It had planted 670 acres, sprayed 670 acres, mowed 40 acres of county ditches, and pulled equipment Dale had no business pulling with 35 horsepower. It hadn't quit once after the engine rebuild. Dale grabbed a rag and wiped down the hood. He checked the oil, topped off the coolant, and greased every fitting. Then he backed it into the corner of the far shed, covered it with a new tarp, and turned off the lights. He didn't sell it. He didn't scrap it. He kept it. By December, the whole township knew the story. Dale Hutchins had lost everything in a fire, refused financing, and farmed 670 acres with a 1957 Massey Ferguson and borrowed equipment. He'd cleared over $100,000. He'd paid cash for a newer tractor, and he'd done it all while Carl DePrairie, with his $600,000 worth of deer iron, had netted $83,000 on 2,400 acres. Carl stopped making offers on Dale's land. In January, Dale ran into Carl at the co-op. Carl was picking up seed corn. Dale was buying hydraulic fluid. They stood in line together, not speaking. Finally, Carl said, "I heard you bought a 6713. "That's right. Massey Ferguson, huh?" "Yeah." Carl shifted his weight. "You gonna keep running that old 35? Dale looked at him. "Every spring, planting season. That tractor doesn't owe me anything, but I owe it everything." Carl nodded slowly. Then he said something Dale didn't expect. "I respect that." Spring 2020 came around. Dale planted with the Massey Ferguson 6713, faster, easier, more comfortable. He covered 670 acres in 9 days instead of 3 weeks. But when it was done, he walked to the far shed, pulled the tarp off the 35 and fired it up. He used it for side work, mowing, light tillage, hauling wagons. People asked him why he kept it running. Dale's answer was always the same. "That tractor brought me back when nothing else could." Here's what Dale Hutchins proved in one growing season. That horsepower doesn't always mean newer. That pride isn't about what you own. It's about what you're willing to run when everything else is gone. That a 1957 Massey Ferguson with 35 horsepower and a rebuilt engine can outwork a man's fear, a township's doubt, and a bank's spreadsheet if you're willing to sit on a steel seat for 14 hours a day and refuse to quit. The barn fire took Dale's fleet. The insurance company lowballed him. The bank wouldn't finance him. But a $200 tractor his grandfather stored in a forgotten shed gave him something nobody else could, a second chance. And in farming, that's worth more than resale value, financing terms, or the newest iron on the dealer lot. Because when you're sitting in the wreckage of everything you built, looking at twisted metal and ash, the machine that starts is the one that matters. Dale Hutchins learned that the hard way, and he's never forgotten it.